The metal was cold and sharp against her palm, a brutal anchor in the swirling, deafening chaos of the medevac helicopter. Sergeant Ava Rostova's fingers were locked, a white-knuckled fist around the two sets of dog tags. Her own and hers. The chains were tangled, a permanent knot, just like their fates had been. The engine's roar was a physical thing, vibrating through the canvas seat and deep into her bones, but it was a distant hum compared to the screaming silence in her own mind. She stared, unseeing, at the grimy floor, her uniform stiff with a dark, flaking crust of dust and blood that was not her own. A coppery tang, the ghost of the firefight, still clung to the back of her throat. Every bump, every lurch of the chopper sent a fresh jolt of reality through her. It was over. She was going home. The thought should have been a relief, a prayer answered. Instead, it was a sentence. She was going home, and Maria was not. A single traitorous image flashed behind her eyes, vivid and cruel. Maria's face, lit by a canopy of 1,000,000 Afghan stars, her smile easy and bright. "Listen, Rostova, we both go home." "No matter what?" "That's not a request. That's an order from your superior medic." She had laughed, a warm, rich sound that seemed to push back the oppressive darkness of the war-torn landscape. They had sealed it with a handshake, a childish pact between two soldiers who had seen too much to believe in fairy tales, but who desperately needed to believe in each other. Now that promise was a shattered thing, a piece of shrapnel lodged in Eva's soul. The memory was a physical pain, a sharp twist beneath her ribs. She looked down at her clenched fist, slowly, mechanically, forcing her fingers to uncurl. The tags lay in her palm. One set was hers, stamped with her name and service number. The other, Maria's. She ran her thumb over the raised letters of Maria's name, feeling every groove, every sharp edge. Santiago, a name that meant laughter and courage, and a son waiting for his mother. A name that was now just a piece of metal, a memory to be delivered. The helicopter banked sharply, and a sliver of harsh afternoon light cut through the open door, glinting off the steel in her hand. The light was a sudden, brutal reminder of the sun beating down on the valley just hours before, of the dust and the noise and the moment everything ended. She remembered the feel of the grit in her teeth, the weight of the machine gun, the steady, reassuring sound of Maria's voice in her ear. And then, the silence that followed the sniper's shot. A silence more deafening than any explosion. A void where her best friend's voice had been. Ava's breath hitched, a ragged, torn sound lost in the rotor's blast. She curled her fingers back into a fist, the metal biting into her skin once more, a welcome pain. It was the only thing that felt real. The promise was broken. She was flying away from the dirt where she had left a part of herself, carrying only this cold, hard proof of a life lived and lost. She was going home, but a part of her would forever be in that bloody, sun-scorched valley, lying beside Maria Santiago. The helicopter droned on, carrying her toward a future she never wanted, toward a homecoming that felt like a betrayal. The memory of the chopper faded, replaced by the ghost of a different heat, the dry, baking warmth of a Georgia afternoon. It was there, at Fort Benning, where their story had begun. Ava Rostova had been a ghost herself then, quiet and self-contained, a Montana girl who spoke more to her rifle than to the people around her. She was a puzzle no one cared to solve, until Maria Santiago crashed into her life with the force of a summer storm. Maria, who insisted everyone call her Rio. She'd bounded into the barracks, a whirlwind of energy and laughter, her Chicago accent a sharp, musical contrast to the drawls and silences. She'd taken one look at Eva meticulously folding her socks and declared, "You and I are going to be friends. You look like you think too much, and I talk enough for both of us." Eva had just stared, unsure how to process this onslaught of personality. Rio was everything Eva was not. Gregarious, effortlessly charismatic, she could talk a drill sergeant into a better mood or coax a smile from the most exhausted trainee. But Ava soon learned her noise was a cover, a smokescreen for a will of pure titanium and a heart that was fiercely, protectively loyal. During a brutal land navigation exercise, Eva, plagued by blisters and disorientation, was ready to quit. Rio, who had already found her own points, tracked her down. She didn't carry Eva's pack. She didn't coddle her. She just walked beside her, talking a steady stream of nonsense about deep dish pizza and her son, Mateo, and how the stars here were all wrong compared to the ones over Lake Michigan. She shared her water and her determination until they both stumbled across the finish line, late but together. That was the heart of their pact, forged long before that night in Afghanistan. It was never spoken, just understood. They had each other's backs. Rio spoke of Mateo constantly. She had a photo of him, a gap-toothed 5-year-old with her same dark, expressive eyes tucked into the webbing of her helmet. "Everything is for him," she'd say, her voice losing its boisterous edge, becoming soft and full of a terrifying, powerful love. "Every mile I run, every weapon I clean, every dumb rule I follow. It's all for him. I'm going to make a life he can be proud of." Ava, who had joined out of a sense of duty mixed with a desire to escape a quiet future, found her own purpose reflected in Rio's. Her friend's dream became a shared one. They spent long nights in the barracks, one polishing boots, the other writing letters, building a friendship not just on shared hardship, but on shared hope. They dreamed of a life after the Army. Rio wanted to be a nurse, to use the skills the Army taught her to heal in a world without war. Ava, inspired by her, thought maybe she could too. They planned to open a diner, a crazy, wonderful idea where Rio would cook and Ava would manage the books. They would be a family, with Mateo at the center of it all. It was during one of these late-night planning sessions, the air thick with the smell of boot polish and ambition, that Rio first laid down the law. "No matter where we are, no matter what happens over there, we both come home. You hear me, Rostova? We look out for each other. We both make it back to that kid." It was a promise born of love, a shield against the fear they never otherwise acknowledged. It was their North Star, the single unshakable rule in a world about to be defined by chaos. The present snapped back with the violent lurch of the MRAP hitting a pothole. The dream of a diner and a peaceful future evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of the Jari district. Dust, fine and suffocating, seeped into the vehicle's interior, coating their teeth and lining their throats. Ava, perched in the gun turret, scanned the relentless landscape. The green zone was a cruel misnomer. The lush vegetation along the riverbed wasn't a paradise. It was a wall, a perfect hiding place for death. Her world was a circle of sky and the baked, rocky earth below, her hands resting on the grips of the M240 machine gun, her knuckles tense. The convoy was a slow, vulnerable caterpillar crawling through the valley, and every rock, every abandoned compound, every fold in the terrain was a potential trigger. She could feel the tension in the air, a static charge waiting to ignite. Down below, in the relative safety of the armored hull, she knew Rio would be doing her own kind of preparation. Ava could almost picture her. She'd be running a final check on her med kit, her fingers deft and sure, ensuring every roll of gauze, every packet of hemostatic agent was exactly where she needed it. She would touch the photo of Mateo taped inside the lid of her aid bag, a silent ritual, a touchstone for her courage. Rio's voice came through the internal comms, calm and steady, a familiar anchor in the unnerving quiet. "Heads up, folks. Keep your eyes sharp. This is the part of the tour I don't like." Someone crackled a nervous joke in response, but Ava didn't laugh. Her focus was absolute. She swept the gun left to right to left, her body a coiled spring. The weight of the promise felt heavier here than it ever had under the stars. It was no longer a hopeful dream. It was a duty, a mission objective. They were in the belly of the beast now, and the only thing that mattered was the person next to you. The sun beat down a hammer on steel. The only sounds were the grind of the engines and the crunch of tires on gravel. It was the quiet that was the most terrifying. It was the silence before the storm. Ava took a slow, measured breath, the dust tickling her nostrils. She thought of Rio's laugh, of Mateo's smile in the photograph. She thought of their diner, and she kept scanning, her finger resting lightly beside the trigger, guarding the caterpillar as it inched its way through the green, waiting for the world to explode. The world did not explode. It disintegrated. A deafening roar tore the air apart as the lead vehicle vanished inside a sudden, blooming flower of orange fire and black smoke. The concussion hit their MRAP like a physical blow. For a fraction of a second, there was a stunned, absolute silence. Then the canyon erupted. The sharp, repetitive crack of AK-47s and the heavier thud of PKM machine guns echoed from the high ground, a deadly symphony that swallowed all other sound. "Contact right! Enemy on the ridge!" Ava screamed, her training seizing control of her body. She swung the heavy M240, the metal groaning in protest, and pressed the trigger. The weapon came alive, a brutal, chattering extension of her will. Spent shell casings spewed from the ejector port, clattering and spinning in the air before raining down into the hull below. The smell of cordite, sharp and acrid, filled her nostrils. Through the smoke and dust, her world narrowed to the flickering muzzle flashes on the ridge. She fired controlled, devastating bursts, hosing down the enemy positions, trying to pin them down, to create a pocket of safety in the chaos. Her ears rang from the noise, her shoulder ached from the recoil, but she was a rock, an unmoving point of violence in the storm. Below, she knew Rio was already in motion. Her voice was calm and clear in Ava's headset, a lifeline cutting through the panic. "Moving casualty 2. Suppress that ridge, Ava. Keep their heads down!" Ava could just make out a blur of movement. Rio, her aid bag slung over her shoulder, was out of the vehicle, crouched low, sprinting towards the shattered husk of the lead Humvee, where a soldier was slumped against a tire. She moved with a fluid, fearless grace, completely exposed. Ava poured fire onto the ridge, her jaw clenched so tight it felt like the bone might crack. Every second Rio was out there was an eternity. She saw her reach the wounded man, saw her drag him behind the relative cover of the burning vehicle's engine block. Rio was a medic, a healer, but in this moment, she was the most vulnerable person on the battlefield. Ava kept firing, her world defined by the need to protect her friend, to keep the promise they had made under the peaceful, forgotten stars. The enemy fire was relentless, rounds pinging and sparking off the armor around her. She was a beacon, a target, and she didn't care. As long as Rio was out there, she would stand in that turret and hold the line. It was their pact. It was all that mattered. A new sound cut through the cacophony, a sound that turned Eva's blood to ice. It wasn't the ragged blast of an RPG or the chaotic rattle of automatic fire. It was a single sharp, high-velocity crack, a sniper rifle. The sound was clean and precise, a needle of noise in the frayed fabric of the battle. In her headset, Rio's steady stream of instructions cut off. Not mid-word, but in the space between breaths. There was no final cry, no gasp of pain, just silence. A void where her best friend's voice had been. "Rio, status! Report!" Ava screamed into her mic, her own voice sounding thin and desperate against the backdrop of gunfire. Only static hissed back at her. She strained her eyes, peering through the swirling smoke. She could see the shape of the burning Humvee. She could see the wounded soldier Rio had been tending to, now frantically trying to apply a bandage to his own leg. But of Rio there was nothing. No movement, no sign. A cold, sick dread, colder than any Montana winter, clenched in her stomach. "Santiago, answer me!" she yelled again, her voice cracking. The silence was an answer. It was a verdict. Protocol demanded she stay at her post. She was the only heavy weapon providing suppressing fire. To leave was to abandon her duty, to endanger every other life in the convoy. But the promise, their childish, sacred pact, screamed in her head, drowning out the voice of reason. We both go home, no matter what. Rio was out there, alone. The image of Mateo's smiling face, the one taped inside her helmet, flashed before her eyes. Without another thought, without a conscious decision, Ava released her grip on the machine gun. She ripped the comms headset from her ears, the sudden roar of the battlefield rushing in to fill the void. She scrambled down from the turret, her body moving on an instinct deeper than training, older than duty. She hit the ground hard, the impact jarring her teeth. The world outside the armored shell was a maelstrom of noise and terror. Bullets whined overhead, kicking up fountains of dirt around her. She ignored them. Her entire being was focused on a single point across the kill zone. She began to run, her boots slipping on the loose gravel. It was not the sprint of a soldier, but the desperate, lunging charge of a woman trying to outrace fate. Every instinct screamed at her to take cover, to hit the dirt, but she pushed forward, a moving target in a storm of steel. She had to reach Rio. The promise demanded it. The world narrowed to the few feet of broken earth between her and the huddled form behind the burning Humvee. A round snapped past her ear, so close she felt the wind of its passage. She didn't flinch. She dove the last few feet sliding on the gravel, her body coming to a jarring stop beside Rio. For a heart-stopping second, she allowed herself a sliver of hope. Maybe she was just pinned down. Maybe she was wounded, but okay. That hope died the instant she saw the wound. It was high on the chest, just below the collarbone, a small, neat entry point that betrayed the catastrophic damage it had done inside. Eva's training, her medic's knowledge, assessed the situation in a cold, clinical instant. The bleeding was internal. There was no pressure to apply, no tourniquet that could help. It was a death sentence. A low, wounded sound escaped Eva's throat. She reached for her own aid pouch, her hands trembling violently, fumbling with the straps. Rio's eyes were open, staring at the dusty blue sky. They were clouded with shock, but a flicker of recognition sparked in their depths as Eva's face came into her view. Her lips moved, trying to form a word, but only a faint, wet whisper emerged. Her right hand, slick with blood, twitched and feebly rose from the ground. It didn't reach for the wound. It didn't clutch at Eva's arm. Instead, her trembling fingers went to her own neck, to the two metal tags resting against her skin. She tapped them weakly, her eyes locking with Eva's, pleading, insistent. The message was as clear as if she had shouted it. "Take them!" "Take them home to him?" Eva's fumbling stopped. The useless bandages fell from her numb fingers. This was not a wound she could fix. This was a last request. With hands that were suddenly, strangely steady, she reached out. Her fingers, stained with grime and her friend's blood, gently unclasped the chain from around Rio's neck. The metal was warm from her skin. As she lifted the tags away, she saw Rio's body relax, a final surrendering sigh escaping her lips. The fierce light in her eyes dimmed, and the stare became vacant, fixed on an eternity Eva could not see. The battle raged around them. The roar of the fire, the staccato of gunfire, the shouts of men, it all faded into a distant, meaningless hum. In that bubble of terrible silence, Eva knelt, holding the dog tags. The weight of them in her palm was immense, the weight of a life, of a promise broken, of a future stolen. She had run through hell to keep their pact, and she had arrived only in time to receive her friend's final orders. The downdraft of the approaching medevac helicopter began to whip the dust into a frenzy, a brutal and mocking imitation of life. The evacuation had arrived, but for Maria Santiago, it was too late. The forward operating base was a paradox of noise and isolation. The constant thrum of generators, the distant shout of a drill sergeant, the clatter of armored vehicles. It was all a wall of sound that somehow emphasized the profound silence clinging to Eva. She stood under a lukewarm shower, still in her filthy uniform, the water turning to muddy rivulets at her boots. She hadn't been able to take it off. To remove the stiff, blood-caked fabric felt like a final betrayal, an admission that the event was over. In her right hand, she still clutched the two sets of dog tags, the chains hopelessly tangled. The command debrief had been a blur of stern faces and official language. Bravery under fire. Sacrifice. A credit to the uniform. The words were empty shells, clattering against the numb void inside her. They gave her a medal, a polished piece of metal on a colorful ribbon. She took it without feeling, her fingers brushing against the cold, pristine surface. It felt like a trinket, a cheap imitation of the weight she now carried. Later, alone in the barren confines of her bunk, she finally moved. With mechanical slowness, she peeled off her uniform, letting it fall to the floor in a stiff, crumpled heap. She sat on the edge of her cot, wearing only her damp t-shirt and shorts, and looked at the two objects in her hands, the metal shiny and meaningless, the dog tags dull, scratched, and real. She placed the metal on the footlocker, a forgotten thing. Then, with immense care, she began to untangle the chains. It was a slow, painstaking process, her fingers clumsy with exhaustion and grief. When they were finally separate, she held Rio's tags in one hand and her own in the other. She remembered the letter. Rio had given it to her months ago, a sealed envelope with "just in case" scribbled on the front. A dark joke that didn't feel so funny anymore. Eva's hands trembled as she broke the seal. The paper inside was simple, the handwriting bold and looping, so full of Rio's personality. My Ava, if you're reading this, well, I guess I owe you $20 from our last poker game. Don't try to collect from Mateo. Listen to me. Tell him stories about me, the good ones and the silly ones. Tell him I was brave, but that it's okay to be scared. Most of all, tell him I loved him more than anything in this whole world. More than my own life. You make sure he knows that. And you look after yourself. You live a big, beautiful life for both of us. Go open that diner. Put something on the menu for me. I love you, sister. Rio. Eva read the words once, then again, and a third time until they were burned into her soul. The dam inside her finally broke. A raw, guttural sob tore from her throat, a sound of such profound anguish it felt like it would rip her in two. She curled into a ball on the thin mattress, clutching the letter and the dog tags to her chest, her body shaking with the force of her grief. The tears came then, hot and endless, washing away the dust of the valley but not the pain. They were tears of loss, of guilt, of a promise shattered. But woven through the despair was a new, grim determination. Rio's last words were not a plea. They were an order. The mission had changed. She had survived. Now she had to learn how to live. The homecoming ceremony was a spectacle of polished perfection under a bright, indifferent sun. The grass was impeccably green, the flags snapped crisply in the breeze, and the ranks of uniforms were straight and proud. Ava stood at attention, her dress uniform feeling like a costume, the stiff collar chafing against her neck. A general with a chest full of ribbons pinned a medal to her jacket, his words of praise and valor lost in the wind, meant for the cameras and the dignitaries. Ava's eyes were dry, her face a mask of stoic composure, but she did not look at the general. Her gaze was fixed on the front row, on a small, heartbreaking figure in a suit that was too big for him. Mateo. He held his grandmother's hand tightly, his lower lip trembling as he tried to mimic the soldiers. Standing as straight and as brave as he could, he had his mother's eyes. In that moment, the medal on Ava's chest felt heavier than the M240 she had manned in the turret. It was a weight of guilt, a symbol of a debt that could never be repaid. The applause from the crowd was a wave of noise that meant nothing. Her war was not here, on this parade field. It was in the silent battle being fought behind a small boy's eyes. When the ceremony ended, the crowd began to mill and talk. Eva moved through them, a ghost in a starched uniform. She walked directly toward Mateo and his grandmother. The older woman's eyes were red-rimmed, filled with a grief that mirrored Ava's own. She gave Eva a small, trembling nod of understanding. Eva knelt, bringing herself down to Mateo's level. The sounds of the ceremony faded away. She looked at his small, serious face, and all the words she had practiced, all the speeches about honor and sacrifice, vanished from her mind. They were empty, adult words. He didn't need a hero. He needed a piece of his mother. She didn't speak. Slowly, deliberately, she unpinned the shiny new medal from her own chest. She looked at it for a moment, this symbol of a day she wanted to forget, and then she gently placed it in Mateo's small, open hand. It was not his to carry. Then, from her pocket, she drew out the set of dog tags that had never grown cold. Maria Santiago's name was facing up. She curled Mateo's fingers around the worn, familiar metal. "Your mom wanted you to have these," she whispered, her voice thick but clear. "She loved you more than anything." Mateo looked down at the tags, his small finger tracing the engraved letters of his mother's name. A single tear rolled down his cheek and splashed onto the metal. He didn't wipe it away. He just held them, a tangible piece of the mother he had lost. Ava rose. She didn't look back at the ceremony. She walked away from the crowds and the flags, out of the uniform and into the rest of her life. The war was over, but her duty was not. She had kept one part of the promise. She had survived. Now, her mission was to live for them both, to be the keeper of a memory, the teller of stories, the aunt a brave little boy deserved. She had carried her friend home, and in doing so, she had found a new reason to keep going.